When we think of Vikings, the first image that comes to mind is often that of bearded warriors in horned helmets, an image both inaccurate and deeply masculine. But there's another side to the Norse world, one just as compelling and often overlooked: the women. Viking women played crucial roles in shaping the Norse world, both at home and beyond. Far from passive figures, they were active participants in trade, politics, exploration, religion, and even warfare. Their lives were complex, multifaceted, and deserved to be examined with the same depth as their male counterparts. In the Viking Age, society was structured around family and kinship. The household, or heimili, was the center of life, and women often ran it. When the men went off to sea for raiding or trading missions that could last months, women stayed behind not just as caretakers but as managers of farms, estates, and sometimes entire villages. The Norse legal system even supported this autonomy. Women could inherit land, file for divorce, and reclaim dowries. Documents like the Graga's laws from medieval Iceland reveal that Norse women had legal standings that, in many cases, surpassed those of their contemporaries in Christian Europe. The key role of a woman in the Viking household was that of the husfreyja, the lady of the house. This was not a decorative title. The husfreyja had control over domestic resources and wielded the household keys, a symbol of authority. Archaeological finds have frequently uncovered keys in women's graves, highlighting their status and control over property and goods. These weren't just tools, they were symbols of power. But Viking women were not confined to their homes. Some joined trading expeditions, traveled across Europe, and even reached the Middle East. Norse sagas tell us of women who owned ships, ran businesses, and settled new lands. The Icelandic sagas are particularly rich in stories of strong, assertive women, like Aud the Deep-Minded, a widow who led her clan to settle in Iceland and claimed land in her own name. Such stories weren't seen as extraordinary in the Norse world. They were part of the social fabric. Marriage, too, was an area where Viking women had surprising rights. While arranged marriages were common, a woman could reject a suitor and could initiate divorce if she felt mistreated or if her husband had abandoned her. The dowry system worked both ways. Families provided women with goods, land, or livestock that remained her personal property even after marriage. In a divorce, she could take it all back, sometimes along with compensation if the separation was her husband's fault. Children were also central to Viking women's lives, though child-rearing was a shared responsibility within the household and extended family. Both boys and girls were valued, although sons were expected to carry the family name forward. However, girls were often named after strong maternal ancestors, suggesting a deep respect for matrilineal heritage. Religiously, women were guardians of rituals and traditions. They maintained family shrines and honored the gods with offerings. Some became priestesses or gidjas, women dedicated to the service of specific gods, often Freya or Frigg. These roles placed them in charge of seasonal festivals, sacrifices, and the maintenance of sacred spaces. Religious authority, like domestic authority, was a form of real power. We also have evidence that women held social influence beyond their families. Widows, especially, could become powerful figures. With their husbands dead and children grown, they controlled estates and wealth without male oversight. Some became benefactors, storytellers, even lawmakers in their local communities. In places like Iceland and the Danelaw regions of England, such women were documented witnesses in legal disputes and property transactions. One reason Viking women have often been marginalized in historical narratives is the lack of direct written records from the Norse themselves. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, foreign chronicles, and the sagas, which were written down a couple of centuries after the Viking Age. But modern scholarship has started to peel back these layers and reveal the complex, varied lives Viking women led. Whether managing the farm, negotiating a trade deal, performing a sacred rite, or setting sail to unknown shores, Viking women were essential players in the Norse world. They were not silent bystanders in a male-dominated saga. They wrote their own stories in deeds, in family lines, in the way they shaped the Viking world from within. Their impact is not only worthy of acknowledgement, it demands a rethinking of what we mean when we say Viking. The image of Viking life is often dominated by warriors raiding distant shores, but much of Norse society was driven not by plunder but by trade. Viking ships didn't only carry axes and shields, they carried furs, amber, textiles, and silver. In this vast interconnected network of commerce, Viking women played a vital and often underestimated role. Far from being limited to domestic duties, many Norse women were deeply involved in trade and the economic lifeblood of their communities. Archaeological evidence and historical records point to their active participation in both local and long-distance markets. Their status and wealth weren't just inherited or acquired through marriage. Many women were self-sufficient economic agents who owned property, ran businesses, and made deals in their own names. At the heart of this activity was the home, which functioned as both a domestic space and an economic center. Women oversaw the production of wool, linen, and garments, all valuable commodities in both Scandinavian and foreign markets. High-quality Viking textiles were prized across Europe and the Middle East. The production process, from spinning to weaving to dyeing, was complex and labor-intensive, and Norse women mastered it. The knowledge of materials, colors, and trade value made them experts in their own right. But some women didn't stop at production. They became merchants, traveling along rivers and coastal routes to sell their goods. Excavations at trading hubs like Hedeby, Ribe, Berka, and Kaupang have revealed artifacts associated with female traders, including weights, scales, and key symbols of economic control. In Berka, women's graves have been found with imported jewelry and foreign coins, suggesting that they not only handled wealth, but also understood its broader exchange value. One of the most compelling aspects of Viking trade was its scale. Norse merchants sailed from the North Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. Viking artifacts have been found as far as Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Silk Road. Slavic and Arab sources mention encounters with Norse traders, many of whom included women. The travel wasn't just the domain of men. Some women crossed seas and rivers, founded settlements, and acted as cultural mediators between Norse and foreign communities. One of the clearest examples of this is in the colonization of new lands. When Norse explorers settled Iceland, Greenland, and parts of the British Isles, women were among the first to arrive. They weren't passive passengers, they were pioneers. According to the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, which details the colonization of Iceland, women like Aud the Deep-Minded led entire expeditions. After the death of her husband, Aud commissioned a ship, gathered followers, and sailed to Iceland, where she claimed land for her kin. She established a farm, distributed land to her followers, and lived out her days as a respected matriarch. Her story is not portrayed as exceptional, but as part of the expected resilience and agency of a Norse woman. In Greenland, women participated in farming, managing livestock, preserving food, and building homes. They played key roles in adapting Norse practices to new and harsh environments. Far from civilization, their survival depended not on obedience, but initiative. They bred animals, processed dairy, and organized winter storsal while raising children and keeping households functioning. Their work laid the foundations for generations of settlers in some of the most inhospitable places known to the Norse. Some even crossed into realms usually considered off-limits for women. In Russes and the Islamic world, women may have served as trade liaisons, translators, or even couriers. Scandinavian travelers were often multilingual, and women who married into foreign communities likely acted as cultural bridges sharing Norse traditions while adopting local customs. In this way, they became transmitters of language, fashion, and belief systems. Their reach wasn't limited to goods. Viking women carried stories, symbols, and faith. Many wore amulets, including Thor's hammers and solar discs, suggesting a spiritual identity that traveled with them. They also carried traditions of song, food preparation, and domestic designalements that transformed foreign settlements into recognizably Norse homes. Economic power translated into social power. Wealthy women, especially widows, or those whose husbands were away for long periods, exercised significant autonomy. They managed land leases, oversaw labor, and controlled surplus production. In legal documents from Norse settlements in Britain and Ireland, women appear as landowners, witnesses, and litigants. Their names are on contracts, their property disputes recorded. These were not ornamental figures. They were fully involved in the commercial life of the Viking world. This blend of mobility, knowledge, and pragmatism made Viking women more than just helpers. They were decision-makers, risk-takers, and builders of communities. Their presence in trade routes and colonial settlements was essential not only for their skills in labor, but for the stability and continuity of Norse culture abroad. The Viking Age was as much about creation as it was about conquest. While men may have claimed glory in battle, it was often women who ensured that what they built would endure. Through trade, settlement, and leadership, they expanded the Norse world not just geographically, but socially and economically. In the Viking world, magic was not a relic of superstition. It was a living force, woven into daily life, deeply respected and feared. And at the heart of this mystical tradition stood women. Priestesses, seeresses, and witches occupied a sacred, liminal space in Norse society, both revered and avoided. Their roles connected them to the gods, the dead, and the unknown. These were the women who shaped fate, who read the omens, who chanted in tongues while holding staffs and wearing cloaks laced with ritual significance. These were the Valjur. The Volva, plural, Voljur, was a seeress, a woman of deep spiritual power. Her primary role was to practice seether, a complex form of magic that involved prophecy, communication with spirits, and influence over fate. Seither was associated with the Norse goddess Freya, and to a lesser extent with Odin, though Odin's use of it was often viewed as subversive, even dangerous, because seither was considered inherently feminine. Practicing it meant stepping outside rigid social norms, and for men, it came with accusations of ergi, or unmanliness. But for women, it was a recognized and sometimes celebrated role. The Volva was not a common figure. She lived on the edge of society, often literally on the outskirts of towns or in isolated farms. Yet when she arrived, she was welcomed with ceremony. The most famous account of such a visit comes from the saga of Eric the Red. In it, a Volva named Thorbjorg is invited to a Greenlandic settlement during a time of famine and despair. She is dressed in rich, ritualistic clothing, blue cloak, glass beads, catskin gloves, and a staff with a carved knob. She performs a ceremony involving songs and trance, offering visions of the future and advice to the settlers. The account is detailed and respectful, showing the Volva as a figure of authority and mystery. The attire of these women was never accidental. Archaeological finds of female graves containing staffs, elaborate cloaks, and amulets suggest that Valur were not just fictional creations. The Oseberg burial in Norway, often believed to be that of a high-status woman or priestess, included a richly decorated wagon, tapestries, and a staff that some interpret as magical in nature. The grave's contents, along with its ceremonial layout, suggest deep ritual significance. Beyond seither, women also engaged in other forms of spiritual and magical practice. They prepared protective charms, interpreted dreams, and performed healing rituals. Some were midwives who acted as spiritual guardians during childbirth, believed to ease the soul's transition into the world. Others specialized in rune magic or incantations designed to protect ships, animals, or children. But there was a darker side to this mystical power. While some magic users were respected, others were feared. Accusations of witchcraft could lead to exile or execution, especially as Christianity began to spread through the Norse world. Pagan rituals were demonized, and the old gods were replaced by saints and clerics. Women who once held positions of spiritual leadership were now cast as heretics, sorceresses, or devil worshippers. Despite this, the traditions didn't vanish overnight. Elements of Norse magic survived in folk practices passed down through generations. Women continued to whisper charms against illness, to wear amulets of Thor or Freya, to mark doors with runes. The Christianization of Scandinavia was gradual. and the spiritual resilience of Norse women helped preserve fragments of the old ways even as the official religion shifted. The importance of female magic users in the Viking world also had mythological roots. Norse cosmology is full of powerful women who control fate and reality. The Norns, three mysterious figures who dwell at the roots of Yggdrasil, weave the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Even Odin, chief of the gods, must bow to the fate they decree. Then there's Freyja herself, goddess of love, war, and magic, who taught Seether to the Aesir. Her dual nature, both nurturing and ferocious, mirrored the spiritual power of Norse women. In daily life, this meant that a woman's connection to the divine was more than symbolic. It gave her agency, authority, and a voice in matters both personal and communal. In a society built around family and kinship, the ability to influence fate wasn't just mystical, it was political. Interestingly, there were male practitioners of Seether too, such as Odin, but their roles were far more fraught. For men, engaging in feminine-coded magic risked social ridicule or worse. This reinforces the idea that Seether was a distinctly female domain that gave women power where other societal avenues might have been closed. And it wasn't always about fear and prophecy. Women also officiated life events, births, marriages, funerals. Their chants, blessings, and rituals bound communities together and kept tradition alive. They marked the seasons, gave thanks to the land, and asked the gods for fertility and protection. These roles didn't make headlines or get carved into runestones, but they were the glue of Viking spiritual life. Ultimately, Viking women of magic held a paradoxical position. They were outsiders and insiders, respected and feared, sacred and dangerous. They lived in the spaces between the living and the dead, the natural and supernatural, the male and female. And in doing so, they carved out a unique kind of power, one that could not be taken by sword or law. In Norse society, to know the future was to hold the strings of the present, and the ones who held those strings were often women. Among the most enduring and controversial figures in Norse history is the Shield Maiden, a woman who fought alongside men in battle. Were they myth, metaphor, or historical reality? The truth, as with much in the Viking world, lies somewhere in between legend and evidence. Old Norse sagas and poetry are rich with tales of women who wielded swords, led armies, and embraced death with the same ferocity as their male counterparts. Lagertha, the legendary wife of Ragnar Lothbrok, is said to have fought fiercely in battle, dressed in male armor. The Hervarar saga tells of Hervor, who trained in warfare, dressed as a man, and reclaimed her father's cursed sword from beyond the grave. And then there's Brynhild, the Valkyrie turned mortal, who fought with supernatural skill before being bound by fate and prophecy. But do these tales reflect historical fact or romantic invention? For centuries, historians leaned toward the idea that shield maidens were mostly myth. The prevailing belief was that Viking warfare was the realm of men, and the sagas merely used female warriors as narrative tools. However, archaeological evidence has begun to challenge that assumption. In 2017, researchers revisited a high-status warrior grave in Birka, Sweden, originally excavated in the late 1800s and long believed to belong to a male chieftain. The grave contained a full set of weapons, including a sword, axe, spear, arrows, and a game board used for military strategy. It was assumed for over a century that such a burial must belong to a man. But modern DNA testing revealed something extraordinary. The skeleton was female. This wasn't just a woman buried with weapons. It was a woman buried as a warrior, honored with all the symbols of tactical command. Her bones showed no signs of domestic labor or maternal stress, but rather a life consistent with physical training and possible battle injury. This find doesn't prove that all Viking women fought, but it proves that at least some did, and were honored for it. Moreover, other graves have yielded female remains buried with weapons, though their interpretation remains debated. Were these ceremonial? Were they symbols of status? Or do they reflect a warrior role? The truth may be a combination of all three, varying case by case. What matters is that the iconography of the warrior woman was real enough to be honored in death, and that alone tells us something about the possibilities open to women in Norse society. It's also important to understand that combat in the Viking Age wasn't always a professional affair. During raids, defense of homesteads, or internal clan feuds, women likely took up arms when needed. Their strength, agility, and resilience were essential for survival in harsh Nordic environments, and they weren't always afforded the luxury of staying behind the front lines. Beyond physical combat, Norse cosmology wove warrior women into the very fabric of fate. The Valkyrjur, or Valkyries, were semi-divine female beings who chose who would die in battle and who would live. They rode across the skies with spears and armor, guiding the souls of fallen warriors to Valhalla. These mythic figures weren't gentle angels, they were fearsome, often bloodthirsty agents of death. And they were revered, not feared. Their presence in myth may reflect real societal respect for women who took on roles of battle and destiny. The image of the shield maiden also had psychological power. In a world where warfare was brutal and honor meant everything, the idea that women could fight and die with the same valor as men reinforced values of courage, resilience, and loyalty. These traits were not gendered, they were cultural ideals. The sagas do not shy away from showing women who outwit, outperform, and even outfight men. Whether real or legendary, these women were not ridiculed or diminished. They were celebrated. Not all warriors wore armor. Some women wielded power through their words, prophecies, or political maneuvering. But for those who did take up the sword, the sagas grant them a place of honor. They aren't mocked or portrayed as unnatural. Instead, they are part of the heroic tradition. There's also a social layer worth exploring. Viking culture valued personal strength and loyalty to one's kin above strict gender roles. While not every woman became a warrior, those who did were not automatically marginalized. The very existence of the shield maiden archetype suggests a society flexible enough to allow such figures not only to exist, but to be immortalized in its greatest stories. Modern interpretations, whether in films, television, or video games, often exaggerate or simplify these roles, but at their core, they're reaching for something real: the Viking Age's complex view of gender, strength, and honor. Shield maidens remind us that in Norse society, courage and capability mattered more than conformity. Viking women could lead, fight, and command, and sometimes they died on the battlefield sword in hand, head held high.